Everybody. Hope you had a wonderful Hanukkah vacation. It's good to be back. I had a few weeks where I was just unable to teach and give shiurim, given my voice and the condition that was hopefully Bezrat Hashem getting better. But it's good to be back here teaching Torah, and Bezrat Hashem we'll get back to our normal scheduled classes throughout the week. We're continuing our Kosher Curiosities series today. Again, it's been a few weeks since we've touched upon this. Please feel free to check out the YouTube channel and the podcasts for previous classes that we've had. This is our 7th installment, and tonight we're going to be learning from Pninei Halacha the laws of Bishul Goy, the laws of Bishul Akum. Akum stands for Avodat Kochavim, which are non-Jews, and any laws pertaining to food that is cooked by the non-Jew. This subject is going to take 2 classes. It's going to span over a couple classes. We'll learn half of it tonight, and Bezrat Hashem, we will look at the second half next week. So we are in the Pninei Halacha, Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, and he says the following: Siyag nosaf shekav'u chachamim leIsrael kedei leshomram shelo yitpolelu bagoyim hu isur bishul goyim. An additional safeguard that the rabbis established so that the Jew shall not mingle with the non-Jew was the prohibition of bishul goyim, the food being cooked by a non-Jew. Kilomar, as if to say, Gam ka'asher en shum ba'ayat kashrut b'ma'achalim u'basirim shebahem bushelu. Even though you might notice there is no problem with kashrut, with the food that they're preparing, or the utensils that they are making with, meaning the food is kosher and the utensils are kosher, still asur leIsrael le'echol tavshilim shegoy bishel. A Jew is not allowed to consume food that a non-Jew cooked. Bichlal isur habishul, together or included in this rule, kol hamachalim shehuchenu la'achilam al yedei chom shel esh o chashmal, any food that was cooked through fire or electricity, ubichlal ze hamtuganim beshemen amok basir, such as deep fried, or b'ma'at shemen machavat, or pan fried, bitzliya, roasted, or bafia, baked, or kliya batanur, or broiled in an oven. V'chen ma'achalim shehitbashlu bekitor or b'mikrogel, or you have steamed cooked food, or in a microwave, or b'kol derech shemekubal leishtamesh bechom kedei lebashel, or any way that a person can use heat to cook would be included in the prohibition of bishul goy. Aval, however, ma'achalim shehuchanu al yedei goyim bimlicha, if there was food that was prepared through salting, bikvisha, or pickling, or be'ishun kad, or by a cold smoke, mutarim. In that case, it would be allowed. Isur bishul goyim chal al tavshilim sheyesh bahem chashivut mesuyemet. The prohibition of bishul goy applies to cooked dishes that have a certain level of importance to them. Ve'adam yachol lehagisham beseuda mechubedet, and a person is able or is normal to present those foods on a respectable seuda. Umemela hem alulim ligrom lekiruv levavot, because through these foods, what allows people to come together and feel closer together, and that's what the rabbis were worried about. Aval b'ma'achalim peshutim en kol kach chashash lekiruv da'at. However, when it comes to simple foods, the rabbis were not so concerned that there will be mingling. Because again, these foods are not typically served on a fancy table, so therefore the Jews and non-Jews are probably not going to be on those tables. Nevertheless, Shne klalim amru chachamim behagdarat tavshilim chashuvim. The rabbis gave 2 important criteria with regards to what is considered a significant dish. Harishon, first one, she'enam nechalim kemo she'em chayim. The first criteria is that the food cannot be eaten raw. Ela habishul hu shemachshiram la'achila. The cooking of the food is what makes it edible. So, ledugma, for example, halav umotzarav nechalim chayim. You have milk, and any derivatives of milk are able to be consumed raw. V'lachen en bahem isur bishule goyim. And therefore, you have no problem of a goy cooking milk. So if a goy was to cook milk on the stove, assuming the milk is kosher, and the pot is kosher, even though the goy cooked that milk for you and heated up that milk, a Jew is allowed to eat it because milk can be eaten raw and drink raw. Haklal hasheni, the second rule, shehem olim al shulchan melachim lelafet bahem et apat, that these foods are able to be placed on a respectable king's table to go along with bread. אבל אם הם תבשילים שרק אנשים פשוטים רגילים לאוכלם, אין בהם איסור. But if they are foods that only simple people will eat, then and not necessarily, not only that simple people do eat, and you wouldn't necessarily put this on a king's table, then again there is no isur. There's no prohibition if a goy cooks it for you. Haklal harishon hu ha'ikari lema'aseh. The first principle is the main one. Because that is what establishes the law for most foods. The second principle, the second criteria, which is the one of the king's table, is only applies to certain foods. Because of the openness and diversity that we have, one can argue that any type of food can go onto a king's table. Although there are some people that don't agree with this, but in general, the society that we live in today, you can walk into a prime minister's home or president's home or someone of great stature, and he will be eating basic foods. He will be eating pretzels. He'll be eating potato chips, and therefore, in general, that would apply. This second rule wouldn't apply as much as the first one. So let's go into depth into these two, as that's what we're gonna be spending most of the class on, these two criteria of the first one, which is food that cannot be eaten raw, and the second one that it has to go up on a king's table. The first rule, which we said of isur bishule goyim, shemudubar b'machal she'en regilim leochlo chai, talking about food that we are not accustomed to eating it raw. Kelomar, ma'achal she'abishur machshir la'achila. It is food that the cooking prepares it for its eating purposes. Umemela bishul mashma'uti bo. Lefichach, therefore, yesh isur betavshilei basar v'dagim. We have a prohibition of cooked meat and fish. Ho'il ve'enam ne'echalim hayim, because these foods are not eaten raw. Kemo ken, yes, isur betavshilei dagan ve'kemach. Also, we have a prohibition with regards to cooking grain and flour. Kedumat grisim, ptitim, vitriot. Vechen betavshilei kitniot. Also, other types of grain. Kedumat adashim, hummus, orez, rice, chickpeas, the type of lentils. All these foods are not eaten raw, and therefore they would be susceptible to the law of bishul goy. Now, even though technically in the shat adchak, in extenuating circumstances, one could eat raw meat, and one might chew on chickpeas that are not cooked. And also, you have an egg that a person can technically crack open and swallow. Yes, isur bishule goyim. There are still the isur of bishul goy still applies to these foods because most of the world only eats them when cooked. B'chalav ukol motzarav k'gvina v'chema and isur bishule goyim, like we touched upon just a few minutes ago. The milk and derivatives of milk, such as butter and cheese, there is no bishul goy with regards to that. Because you can eat cheese while it's in its raw form. So if a goy wants to make for you a grilled cheese sandwich, takes sliced bread and heats for you a grilled cheese sandwich, there's no issue of bishul goy. Leshem pastor כיוון שאין כוונת הפסול להשפיך את עמו, החלב נחשב כנאכל חי. Now, even though often today milk is boiled for pasteurization, because to remove the bacteria of some sort, it's not intended to enhance flavor. And since that is the case, the milk is still considered a food that can be eaten raw. In addition, beperot and isur, there is no prohibition with regards to fruit, because we generally eat fruit raw. And that is why it is fine to consume fruit preserves, even though that requires them cooking the fruit, because fruit is eaten raw. As well, spices are not subject to the law of Bishul Goy, because they are often mixed into foods that we are eating them raw. Also with vegetables, most of vegetables, there is no problem if a goy cooks the vegetables for you, because they are eaten raw. If a goy wants to make a matbucha, there's no problem for that, because the raw ingredients are there, no pun intended, but the ingredients that are there can be eaten raw, such as the tomatoes, the peppers, and the onions. However, there are certain vegetables that in many places we do not eat them in its raw state. Such as potatoes, kishuim. That would be kishuim would be like a pumpkin style, salak v'chatzilim, eggplant, and therefore there would be the prohibition of bishul goy. However, if you have, my mistake, kishuim would be zucchini, not pumpkins. But all those things, generally some people don't eat them raw. However, but if you're in a place where some people do eat them in its raw state, some people might cut up and put it in your salad. You would not have the problem of bishul goy. Now, even though you yourself, you might not be accustomed to eating them raw, since there might be a lot of people that eat zucchini in its raw state, therefore you can take upon that, not that custom, but that ruling that you would be able to eat them even if a goy baked them for you, because there are some people around that would eat them in a raw state. But if you just heard that there's a guy or two or a family that happens to eat raw zucchini, we still have the prohibition of bishul goy. The status of food being eaten raw depends on its condition before cooking. For example, in the past, people would eat raw wheat kernels. And therefore, if a goy cooked them, there wouldn't be an isur. But if they ground the wheat kernels into flour, since we know flour is not eaten in its raw state, so therefore any dish that is made with flour is asur. Today no one eats raw wheat kernels, and therefore even with wheat kernels that are cooked by a non-Jew would be asur. So for example, if someone wants to make orisa, the chamin, the soft wheat kernels, if a non-Jew makes that for you without any Jewish involvement, then it would be prohibited for a person to eat that chamin, that wheat that was made by a non-Jew. If you have fish or meat that were salted until to the point that can now be eaten, so now you technically can eat the meat and the fish because they were salted. But now you have a goy that came and cooked this fish, And bahem isur, there is no longer a prohibition. Hoil ukva lifnei bishul hayu rechulim lachila, because already from before the goy cooked it, the food was already able to be eaten. ערבו בתבשיל אחד דברים שנאכלים חיים כגבינה וירקות ודברים שאינם נאכלים חיים כקמח וביצה. If you have in one dish certain foods that can be eaten raw, such as cheese and vegetables, and also in that dish you have eggs, הולכים אחר העיקר שגם הברכה נקבעת על פיו. You would follow whatever the ikar food is. So, for example, if you have an omelet would be a perfect example. The eggs part of the omelet cannot be cooked by a non-Jew, but the vegetables can be cooked by a non-Jew because vegetables can be eaten raw. So what happens if a goy makes for you an omelet? In that situation, you would follow the main food. What is the main food there? The main food of an omelet is the eggs. It's not the vegetables, the chopped peppers and mushrooms that you have inside the omelet. The main thing is the eggs. So therefore, and in fact, you would be saying a bracha shakol niyabidvaro on that omelet. You wouldn't be reciting Borei Peri Adama. So therefore, since that is the case, the goy would not allow to make for you a egg omelet without some sort of Jewish intervention, as we are going to see B'ezrat Hashem next class. One final point that we're going to do today, which is the second rule, Haklal Hasheni, which is Oleh al Shulchan Melachim. We said earlier that the second criteria would be that the food needs to be, in order to be subject to Bishul Goy, the food needs to go on the table of a king. Haklal Hasheni. What is Shulchan Melachim? What is the table of kings? It is a meal of very respectful people. What does that mean that accompany the bread? It means food that you would eat as part of a seudah, as part of this official meal. Or as the main part of the meal in order to be satiated. Or כמאכל טעים שרגילים להגיש כקינוח בסוף סעודה, or could be some very delicacies that you would bring as a dessert, or something that makes the meal complete. כלומר, as if to say, גם תבשיל ממאכל שאינו נאכל חי, even if you have a food that you cannot eat it in its raw state. If a person would not eat that food at a very respectable table, then there would be no prohibition with regards to Bishul Goy. And like we said before, everything is dependent upon the generation and the place that you are having that meal. Therefore, in our days, in the 21st century, since there's so many different types of cuisines and there's so much diversity amongst food, והפתיחות לסוגי המטבחים שונים, כל המאכלים שאנשים רגילים להגיש בסעודה יכולים לעלות על שולחן מלכים. One could argue that any type of food that we eat today can actually go on a respectable table. וגם אדם שאינו רגיל להגיש תבשיל מסוים בסעודה מכובדת, and even if a person would not normally bring pretzels, let's say on a fancy סעודה, כל זמן שידוע לו שבסביבתו מקובל לעתים להגישו, יש לו בו איסור בישולי גויים. As long as a person would know that there are people in this world that would put that and would eat that, respectable people as part of their seudah, then there would be an isur, a prohibition of bishul goy. Omnam b'ma'achalim shelo no'adu la'achila o lekinuach b'miskeret seudah. However, if there's a food that you know the purpose of their eating is not for a dessert or it's not for any part of a fancy seudah, kedugmat mamtakim, candy, chocolate, mine klayot, any types of pitzuchim, nuts and grains, peanuts, ushar chatifim, or other types of snacks, any su bishul goyim. In that case, we do not have a bishul goy. So therefore, This is a reason why you can buy potato chips, even though the potato chips that you're eating from Lay's or Ruffles or Miss Vicky's are made by non-Jews. You can buy pretzels, even though they're made by non-Jewish companies, and there's no there's no Jew involved in the creation of those potato chips, because generally these are considered snacks. And snacks, although there are probably kings and prime ministers that do eat chips and pretzels and other types of chocolate and candies, but nevertheless, they don't fall under the category of Bishul Goy. And therefore, you can eat non-Jewish cooked potato chips and pretzels and other types of snacks. Bekafe umashkaot. With regards to I forgot. Sorry, I skipped a point. Bidagne boker uprichiot ores shel isur bishul goyim. When it comes to breakfast cereals and rice cakes, yes isur bishul goyim. Then you would have there is an isur of bishul goy. Hoy luragim leochlam lesova baruchat boker. Because generally that's what people eat in the morning. That is what satisfies a person's hunger during breakfast. So breakfast cereals need to be had some sort of Jewish supervision supervision and involvement in the creation of those foods. Bekafe umashkaot alkoholim en isur bishul goyim. With regards to coffee and other type of alcoholic beverages, they are exempt from bishul goy. Hoil venoadu lishtiyah, because they are meant for drinking. Veikaram ma'im sheregilim lishtot otam hayim. And the main ingredient of all these liquids is water, and water can be drank while in its regular state, not cooked. What is the proof? The proof is that we say the bracha on coffee is shakol niya bidvaro velo ha'etz, and we're not reciting ha'etz. We're not reciting the bracha that you would recite on a fruit, like the coffee beans come from a tree. So why aren't we saying bore peri ha'etz? The answer is because the main ingredient is the water. And again, for vodka and beer, we recite shakol, and we don't say bore pri adama, even though it comes from grain. So since the main ingredient is water, we look at it as water, and therefore, since water is drank in its raw state, out of the tap or out of your water bottle or whatnot, it does not fall into the category of bishul goy, and therefore a goy is allowed to make for you coffee. A goy is allowed to make your beer and your vodka and your scotch or whatnot. The rabbis added an additional reason to allowing this, mainly because coffee and tea are not served generally within the context of a formal meal. And although it is often part of a meal, maybe at the end of a meal, but it's not really dessert. It's just something that people would drink, but not part of a formal meal. So 2 reasons why coffee and tea does not apply to the laws of Bishul Goy. Number 1, because the main ingredient is water. Water is drank in its raw state. And second, generally, it's not part of a fancy meal or within the context of a fancy meal. Next week, we will look at, we'll continue this subject, and we'll look at how to extract something that would fall under the category of Bishul Goy to make it a Bishul Yisrael, to make it cooked by a Jew. What needs to happen? What type of involvement needs to take place? Very practical laws that we will touch upon next week, especially for those that might have some non-Jewish workers in their home present, catering companies, and other things to work on. But now that we have a good basis, we understand why this was instituted and the 2 major criteria. We're able to continue Bezrat Hashem next week with the second part. Wishing everyone a wonderful evening.